All right, everybody, thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name's Rebecca. I'm one of the reference librarians at the East Hampton Library. I know that we have probably some locals joining us and probably some individuals that are Zooming us from afar. So I just want to thank you all so much for joining us. For this lecture tonight. We are joined today by Gary Leising, and we are really excited for this lecture. Gary Leising is a distinguished professor of English and director of general education at Utica University, where his teaching responsibilities include a class on Sylvia Plath. In addition to publishing essays on Plath's work, he has scholarship on other contemporary poets and has published poetry in 3 poetry chapbooks, as well as 1 book titled The Alp at the End of My Street. And again, we are just joined with Gary today to celebrate sort of the commemoration of Sylvia Plath's birthday. So again, thank you everyone for joining us. And Gary, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for having me. This is really exciting to get to do something celebrating Sylvia Plath's work on her birthday, her 90th birthday. And so that's one of sort of 3 purposes that I think I have in this talk. Kind of the first that you can see on the screen now is to share a little bit about some research that I did this summer at Smith College, where they have a vast archive of Sylvia Plath's work, including letters, poems, journals. So I'm going to show you just a few things about especially drafts of poems that I found there. And all of these are cropped. I was really interested in the way she wrote her name differently and identified herself differently at different times in her life. So I just kind of cropped together several of these signatures from poems and letters, and even like the nameplate in one of her journals. So the second reason that I'm here is to talk a little bit about what Utica University has in its Sylvia Plath collection. We just acquired it this summer from the outstanding Sylvia Plath scholar Peter Steinberg, who edited her letters, has authored a book on her, and has another edited collection coming out, I think in next fall. So, this is a photo of everything in our library right now that's part of that collection. And I'm going to talk about some of the things in it. I can't talk about everything because I'm still working my way through it. It's really exciting to get to carve out time in my day to go to the library and open up some of these file boxes and discover things that I didn't even realize were there when we first acquired it. And of course, the third thing is to celebrate that it is Sylvia Plath's birthday. And so this is a birth announcement that is now 90 years old, that was at Smith College. And to go to our own collection at Utica, we do have a copy of her birth certificate there, which is really kind of a nice thing to be holding these documents, to look at them and to see that we're not just reading somebody who has written books and that, the books are there in the library and they're wonderful, but to see all these small elements of her life really does help us to understand her as a person as well as a writer, I think. And it promotes a lot of empathy in us as readers, I think, when we start to delve deeply into our understanding of her life and her work. So one of the things that's really exciting for me, teaching a class on Sylvia Plath, because she is an author who we spend a lot of time thinking about her biography and how that connects her to her work. One of the things that's really exciting is that we now have copies of every biography in the library. Every biography of Sylvia Plath, and these are just 3 different editions of the most recent biography by Heather Clark, which has won all sorts of acclaim. It's an amazing book. But what I like about this, I think by my count, we have sort of about 18 different biographies. It depends how you count things. Some are memoirs, some are biographical criticism rather than strictly biographies. But what I'm excited about is taking students to the collection and having, all of them open up a different biography and look at the ways they tell some of the same events differently, so that we can see biographers' biases, so that we can see that the availability of things like all of Sylvia Plath's letters for Heather Clark has made her biography very different from some of the earliest biographies that were written. And we can really understand how Sylvia Plath scholarship changes over time because of the work that scholars do, and because of the work that they can discover in archives. So I'm also interested in how we can talk about the way Sylvia Plath is often portrayed in culture. And I've always been struck by this sort of one page from Glamour magazine in Spain, showing Sylvia Plath and the fashion that she that they think she would have appreciated. But I'm bothered by this because if you'll notice in the bottom left corner, right, there is a gas oven, and it seems utterly tasteless to be thinking about how we would identify her with the moment of her death, right? Can we only identify her with the worst moment of her life? This is even worse. A few years earlier, Vice magazine did an entire fashion spread of models dressed as women artists and writers who died by suicide. And I think that presents one view of her, and it limits our understanding of her work to think that it only shares that outcome, the end of her life, right? It all is about suicide. It's all about depression. While that's important to understanding her work, it's also not the only thing, and not why her work remains continually read. So for today, I want to talk a little bit about three different books of Plath's. So the first, The Colossus, her first book published 1960, a book of poems. The Bell Jar, published, her novel, published in January of 1963, shortly before her death. And her book, Ariel, which was left as a manuscript. And her husband, Ted Hughes, edited it, changing the order of the poems, removing some poems from the manuscript, adding other poems she had written to the manuscript, and changes dramatically the overall shape of that book. And I think if you look at these quotes here that I've included, I like to talk about this as a counter to that narrative of her life, right? So as her life ends with depression, her books all end with renewal. So the last poem in The Colossus, The Stones, I shall be good as new, is its last line. This isn't the last line of The Bell Jar, but right, she ends with thinking about a ritual for being born twice. And Ariel in her manuscript ended with the word spring, right? And in the introduction to this restored edition, published in 2004, right? So the initial version was published in 65. In the introduction to this, her daughter, Frida Hughes, talks about how Plath intentionally began the first poem with the word love, ends the last poem with the word spring. It's a hopeful kind of narrative arc to the poems, as opposed to Hughes' version, when he edits it and ends it with the poem words, fixed stars govern a life. There's a sense of fate and fatalism to that ending. So in our collection, we have Peter Steinberg did this wonderful project collecting all of the articles that had to do with Sylvia Plath's attempt at suicide in 1953. I like to share this with my students because it's the Utica newspaper from the time. I looked for this presentation, and we have copies of these, and I could not find one from East Hampton. I was hoping to make it local for the library, but I can still share this one, and I think it's interesting, right? These stories were covered, it appears to me, as far north as Maine, as far south as Miami, from the East Coast and obviously the Boston area where she lived, to as far west as Los Angeles. This young girl disappearing. And if you've read The Bell Jar, you know this story because it's a scene in there. She is found after 2 days in the crawl space under her home after having taken a bottle of sleeping pills. So, you know, this was noticed, and it becomes part of The Bell Jar as well, that the articles, the fact that she was in the newspaper, that happens with the character Esther Greenwood, just as it did with Sylvia Plath. So because it's also close to me, at least, I was looking at this from the Albany Times-Union, and I want to kind of focus on this last piece, the latest poem, where it mentions that her latest poem, written when she was the guest editor of the current issue of the magazine Mademoiselle, was entitled Mad Girl's Love Song. It began and ended with the words, "I shut my eyes and all the world drops dead." I think the implication here is that we should read this poem or think about this poem as being a poem of depression, right? She's shutting her eyes and she is dropping dead, just like the world is around her. Here is the entire poem, actually a photograph of Sylvia Plath's copy of Mademoiselle. And I think it's interesting, right? If we look back to see that this implication is to read this biographically, the first line is that all the world drops dead. The second line is, I lift my lids and all is born again. Right, there's this recovery, there's this renewal, or even to the end of the poem, where we start to realize as it goes on, she's not talking about her own death, but she's talking about a beloved who has gone, and she wants that beloved back, though the parenthetical line makes us think that he may not be entirely real. He might be fabricated. I should have loved a thunderbird instead at the end. At least when spring comes, they roar back again. And there is this renewal and this possibility for renewal. I think though the poem could be read as having an element of depression to it because it's someone who has lost their lover, it's also about being born again in the second line. There is a tension there, as with most great poems, right? It talks about the tension between happiness and sadness, between the world dropping dead and the world being reborn. So if we only read it biographically, we do miss part of what makes the poem complicated and engaging for us. So this poem was in Mademoiselle, and Sylvia Plath spent a month in 1953, June, in New York City as a guest editor, a sort of program like being a college intern, a very elite program. Only 20 women were chosen to serve as guest editors for the magazine. And this is just one, well, two photographs that we have in our collection that are places important in Sylvia Plath's life. And this is the Barbizon Hotel, which is fictionalized into the Amazon Hotel in the novel. And it's where all of the women are living. Sylvia Plath was on the 15th floor, I believe. And what's fascinating about these photographs is we can see the places that were important in her life and in her work. We can start to put fictional and biographical events onto a map and really think about the world that she inhabits. And again, I think this helps us to empathize with her as a person, as well as with her characters when we read about them. If we start to realize there is this larger real world that they inhabit. So a little bit about The Bell Jar. It was published, these are sort of 3 first editions, if a book could have 3 first editions. 1963, she published it in the UK under the pseudonym Victoria Lucas, publishing it as a pseudonym because it was so autobiographical. She didn't want people to necessarily know that she was writing about them. In 1966 in the UK, it is published under her name. Not until 1971 does it appear in the US. And the story that's told in the introduction to one of the bell jar editions in the US is that it was realized that an American who published abroad, if the work was not published in America within, I believe it was 10 years of that person's death, that then the copyright would expire and anyone could publish it in America. So there was a sense of pressure that to be able to publish and have a copyright written to her estate, it needed to come out. But that was not without controversy. So there's lots of different editions. These are a handful of them. I'm excited to talk about the different editions with my students because there's a great book by Tracy Brain called The Other Sylvia Plath, and it has a section called Packaging Sylvia Plath. And I'm really interested in looking at the different titles, looking at how the covers have changed over time, what sorts of descriptions are written on the covers of the back covers of the book to try to sell it, to understand how our interpretation and our collective interaction with Sylvia Plath has changed from the time she was initially published up until now in the 21st century. I will also say that these two with the gold sort of cover in the middle, the bantam there, those mean a lot to me because I think that's the version that I first read many years ago. I still have it, a beat up version of it. So, you know, I think everybody who loves the book probably has like a favorite edition, and there's a good chance that we have a copy of that in our collection now. So, as I mentioned, right, she was concerned about the biographical connections in the book, and these are some notes that she's taken on what needed to be changed from one draft to the next, to the final draft. And you'll notice in the top corner that she mentions Esther Greenwood. Initially, she had the character named Victoria Lucas, so it appeared more like a memoir because it was written by the same name as the author. So there's one of the changes, and these notes lead to a letter that was sent to her editor, the first line of which is, "I've not forgotten about the libel issue," as she was worried, or maybe the editor was more worried, that she might say something to have defamed someone in her real life as she converted them into characters. There's a lot in this letter, I think, and I'll go through some of it, that I just think is absolutely hilarious, and her wit is just sparkling in it. For example, this part toward the middle, the bottom of it, the editor, JC, there are dozens of editors on this magazine. It's fictitious, and the only unfavorable thing about her is that Doreen calls her ugly as sin. Surely no present editor who is not beautiful could sue me for this. You know, I just think her humor there is funny, as is when she says that Buddy Willard is based on a real boy, and he was, and you can go through the biographies and her letters and see how closely Buddy Willard follows the life of one of her boyfriends, Dick Norton. And yet she says, "But I think I have made him indistinguishable from all the blonde, blue-eyed boys who have ever gone to Yale. There are millions and hundreds who become doctors and who have affairs with people." I love the humor there. I also admire the fact that she, just as she does in the book when she kind of skewers this character in several places, she completely subverts the kind of male-dominated society, right? The boy who wants to become a doctor and goes to Yale would seem to be somebody elite, and yet she just dismisses him as there's hundreds of people like him. Finally, this one, where she mentions Jane, I'm changing her name to Joan, is fictitious. This is an especially interesting one, because there ends up when The Bell Jar comes out as a movie in 1979. We have a copy of this in our collection, a VHS of The Bell Jar. I'm not sure that we have a VHS player on campus, though. I just today saw a review that the great Gene Siskel wrote of this movie, and he gave it 1 star. And the 3-word summary of his review was trash under glass. That when the movie came out, Jane Anderson, who knew Sylvia Plath and whose life follows Joan, the character of Jones, in several ways, brought a lawsuit against it. And as you can see from the headline, it was settled with an agreement here, that she was unintentionally defamed by the movie. I think this letter, this line especially in it, was a piece of evidence, right? That she said Jane, she was at first called Jane to show that she was like Jane. Of course, if you read Plath's journals, you will see that there's a point where she says that she's making the character out of an kind of amalgamation of both Jane Anderson and Nancy Hunter, 2 people in her life. And so the things that Jane Anderson might have found to defame her actually are fictitious, right? And are not her character at all. But it does raise issues about how closely we read a work as biographical. Right, so these are broad notes that Plath has taken about scenes for the Bell Jar. And I will point that because I'm going to talk about the ending of one of her poems in a minute, that as I was looking at this, I was noticing how in the right-hand page here, you see that it goes to the chapters 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, then 16, 17, 18. On the other side, you see 16, 17, 18, 18, 19, 20, 19, 20 up in the top again, right? I think one thing I've noticed as I've looked at her drafts is that she works over endings a great deal. And she's very consciously crafting the way her works end. And I think that's significant and goes along with my sort of idea that all of her 3 books that she's finished in her life, all of them end with renewal. And so I think, right, even in here, she talks at the end about this is, right, the final interview. She's thinking about how she wants to end very consciously, maybe more consciously than she has thought about beginnings, or she's worked on it at least more, it appears. I want you to listen here to the ending. This is just a minute or so of Maggie Gyllenhaal doing a reading in this CD version of The Bell Jar. If you're interested in this, it's a wonderful, wonderful performance. You can find it, I'm sure, on Audible as well. And I like that we have this in the collection too, because we then make The Bell Jar a little more accessible. And it's worth noting that not only do we have an audio version, we have at least 1 large print edition of The Bell Jar, as well as a 4-volume Braille edition. So just so that you can hear the last section of the last chapter, here is Maggie Gyllenhaal.
My black shoes cracked but polished, and my red wool suit flamboyant as my plans. Something old, something new. But I wasn't getting married. There ought, I thought, to be a ritual for being born twice. Patched, retreaded, and approved for the road. I was trying to think of an appropriate one when Dr. Nolan appeared from nowhere and touched me on the shoulder. All right, Esther. I rose and followed her to the open door. Pausing for a brief breath on the threshold, I saw the silver-haired doctor who had told me about the rivers and the pilgrims on my first day, and the pocked, cadaverous face of Miss Huey, and eyes I thought I had recognized over white masks. The eyes and the faces all turned themselves toward me, and guiding myself by them, as by a magical thread, I stepped into the room.
So I just love the way that ending shows Esther Greenwood, the character, drawn in as if by a magical thread, right? I think that when she uses the word magical, right, she's suggesting even stronger the kind of transformation of rebirth that she had talked about there, right? There is something hopeful. Though at the same time, right, in passages earlier than this, in the chapter, she talks about knowing that that bell jar, the kind of symbol of her depression, could descend on her at any moment in her life. So it is worth talking briefly about Aurelia Plath, Sylvia Plath's mother. In that letter, she talks about my mother being based on my mother, but what do I say to defame her? She is a dutiful, hardworking woman whose beastly daughter is ungrateful to her, even if she were a suing mother, which she is, of course, not. I don't see what she could sue here. If you've read The Bell Jar, I don't know if you feel like I do, that I don't know that she always does portray her completely positively, like this letter seems to suggest. And I think our sympathy is often with, always with Esther Greenwood, who we may feel is a little ungrateful at times, but I don't know that I've ever thought of her as beastly. But there are really interesting things to note and study about the connection between Sylvia Plath and her mother. And to return to that issue of the bell jar being published, Aurelia Plath did not want the bell jar published. There's a collection of letters at Smith College between Aurelia Plath and Olwen Hughes, Sylvia's sister-in-law, who essentially took over as a kind of executor of the estate, making decisions, helping make decisions about what would be republished, where permissions to quote from the work would go. And I found this incredibly moving, this little index card in here, where Aurelia had written, "I'm not only to endure the suffering you inflict upon me, I am to sanction it." Right, she felt that publishing the bell jar would cause more suffering, and that the Hughes family wanted her to say, yes, it's okay. Sadly, maybe sadly, right, she writes on this note, it was not sent. I don't think she would have been able to stop the bell jar from being published in the US if she had tried, but I do often, as much as I love the novel, I also feel conflicted, right? I feel bad for her, knowing the kinds of suffering that she went through as Plath said, as a dutiful mother. There, as kind of an exchange for that, Aurelia Plath was allowed in 1975, I think, to publish Letters Home, a collection of letters Sylvia Plath had written to her. This is an interesting point to note in Plath scholarship, and another thing I'm interested in this collection sharing with my students. So I have here a photo of a bunch of the versions of the letters of Sylvia Plath, and note, right, that sort of on the far right, the 3 editions of Letters Home, right, 3 editions of that are still like not as much as volumes 1 and 2 in terms of page count, I think. There are many things to be said looking at Letters Home and seeing where there are the ellipses to show omitted pieces of letters. I think on the Smith College website, they talk about that and call the version of Sylvia Plath in Letters Home the sanitized version of Sylvia. And so that shapes, for readers who didn't have access to the archives these letters were in, that shapes the way we think about her and her relationship with her mother. Now that we have the letters that Peter and Karen Kukul have edited in these editions, we can see the entire letters, and we can start to reconstruct a fuller version of Sylvia Plath. And I will point out, right, if you're looking to get these yourselves, I think these paperback editions from the UK that are in the middle have even some extra letters that were not available when the first hardback US editions were published. So those might be the ones that you'd want to make sure that you can get. So moving on back in time from the bell jar in 63 to the Colossus in 1960 and 1962, published in the UK and then in the US. The major difference between these is the last poem. In the UK edition, it's a poem called Poem for a Birthday, a sequence of 7 poems. Only a couple of those survive into the US edition. And the last one of those is The Stones. I want to play for you here. This is a recording from a CD that came out from the British Library, so that you can hear Sylvia Plath first introduce the poem and then read the poem. So first, her introduction.
In this last poem, The Stones, the speaker has utterly lost her sense of identity and relationship to the world. She imagines herself, quite graphically, undergoing the process of rebirth, like a statue that has been scattered and ground down, only to be resurrected and pieced together centuries later. Her nightmare vision of waking in a modern hospital gradually softens as she recovers and accepts the frightening yet necessary ties of love, which will heal and return her whole again to the world.
It's healing her and returning her whole again. So it's a brief poem. It's about 2 minutes. This is her reading the poem.
The Stones. This is the city where men are mended. I lie on a great anvil. The flat blue sky circle flew off like the hat of a door when I fell out of the light. I entered the stomach of indifference, the wordless cupboard. The mother of pestles diminished me. I became a still pebble. The stones of the belly were peaceable, the headstone quiet, jostled by nothing. Only the mouth hole piped out, importunate cricket in a quarry of silences. The people of the city heard it. They hunted the stones, taciturn and separate, the mouth hole crying their locations. Drunk as a fetus, I suck at the paps of darkness. The food tubes embrace me, sponges kiss my lichens away. The jewel master drives his chisel to pry open one stone eye. This is the after hell. I see the light. A wind unstoppers the chamber of the ear, old worrier. Water mollifies the flint lip, and daylight lays its sameness on the wall. The grafters are cheerful, heating the pincers, hoisting the delicate hammers. A current agitates the wires, volt upon volt. Catgut stitches my fissures. A workman walks by, carrying a pink torso. The storerooms are full of hearts. This is the city of spare parts. My swaddled legs and arms smell sweet as rubber. Here they can doctor heads or any limb. On Fridays the little children come to trade their hooks for hands. Dead men leave eyes for others. Love is the uniform of my bald nurse. Love is the bone and sinew of my curse. The vase, reconstructed, houses the elusive rose. 10 fingers shape a bowl for shadows. My mendings itch. There is nothing to do. I shall be good as new.
I really love especially the sounds that she builds up in those last three stanzas. Actually, the last two stanzas there, and the one line right before that, where you have nurse rhyming with curse, and then building into these wonderfully soft sibilant sounds, curse, houses, rose, at the ends of lines. It seems so peaceful and calm as it's building up to I shall be good as new at the end. So we have also the book Ariel, which, as I mentioned, appeared edited initially in 1965 by her husband, Ted Hughes. And he added poems to the end of it that Plath had written, but did not leave in her manuscript for Ariel. He took some poems out. Many of them were poems that I think we can read. If we read them biographically, we will read them as portraying him negatively. There's also a couple poems that he leaves out of the 1965 UK edition that portrayed other people that Plath knew in the UK negatively. At least one of those, the poem Lesbos, appears in the 1966 US edition, which also has an introduction by the American poet Robert Lowell. And as I'd mentioned before, it's not until 2004 that the version that was her manuscript appears. Though we did know in 1981 in the collected poems, in the notes at the end, Hughes acknowledges the order of her poems in the manuscript, that they were different than the published version. And these are just some of the many versions of Ariel. Just like the bell jar, it's really fascinating to look at the covers and the way they have changed. And again, thinking about packaging Sylvia Plath, how the US edition comes with the introduction by Robert Lowell, which really does portray her as a depressed writer. I think there's a line in there about how she was playing Russian roulette with 6 bullets in the chamber, right? As if writing these poems is what drove her to her death, which I think is an unfair kind of assessment of someone with mental health issues. So in that restored edition, it includes a typescript, a facsimile of the manuscript, and you can see her table of contents as she wanted them to appear. And I wanted to include this quote from the scholar Gail Crowther, right, that these poems are mostly written on vibrant pink Smith College memorandum paper that she was, when she taught briefly at Smith College, she took bunches of that because she liked it and she liked writing on it, and she'd ask people to send her more. Her writing, Gail had said, swirls and spikes as though the pages are alive and jumping. They almost breathe. And I would really encourage anyone, if you're interested in Plath, if you can get to see her work in an archive, it does seem to be alive and jumping. And I have some images, because these are all in plastic and because of the lighting, the pink doesn't come out exactly well in all of the photos. But this is her poem, Wintering. She has this as the last poem in Ariel. And I want to highlight a few things. So this poem, written on October 8th, just 3 days before her husband, Ted Hughes, who had been having an affair since the summer of 1962, moves out. There's this line in here that disappears from the final version. The men have only their sex and they eat too much honey, which seems like it could be referring to, right, an unfaithful husband. I'm so fascinated in how she worked on the ending of this, and how she worked over it. This is, as I said, it ends with the bees are flying, they taste the spring. So she's had these bees that are wintering, right? They are waiting until the weather is better. They're staying in. She's feeding them with sugar, Tate and Lyle syrup, sugary syrup, and asks at the end, in this first draft, will the hive survive? Will the gladiolas succeed in banking their fires to enter another year? What will they taste of the Christmas roses? And first she ends with questions: snow, water, corpses, spring. Asking those as questions ending with spring seems uncertain that there is rebirth, and having corpses in there, right? To think of like the taste of corpses is macabre and is depressing. She goes on after the first draft to type this ending up. Spring, she changes to a glass wing. So she's getting further away from where the ultimate ending is, I think. Though a glass wing is a kind of lovely, fragile image. Typing it into a third draft and handwriting a version to get to the handwritten piece here. The bees are flying, they taste the spring, which still survives in the typed revision at the bottom. The snow, water, and corpses question, but ultimately she drops those, and I think it gives us such a more hopeful ending, right? Because the last two lines include the Christmas roses. Christmas, of course, right? A happy season, and religiously, it's the season of the birth of a savior for Christians. And then they taste the spring, and we have the season of renewal lying ahead. So I think her decisions and her revisions from the first to the last draft of this to the ending really do show her working toward a theme in her literature of rebirth and renewal. This is the second to last poem in Ted Hughes's version. Edge, the first draft of it, the woman is perfected, her dead body wears the smile of accomplishment. But one thing I want to point out about this poem, everyone who's read it will remember, right? We have each dead child coiled, a white serpent, one at each little pitcher of milk, and the scratched outline in there, she is taking them with her. As she is this is February 5th, she will die by suicide on February 11th. So this is one of the last poems she's written. She's writing about her own depression in this poem, and she is thinking about her children. And there is that really horrifying line, she is taking them with her. So I want to go back and to think about these versions of her writing her name. These two in particular come from letters from the 4th of February, one day before she writes Edge. And this one from a letter to Dr. Buescher, her psychiatrist, who treated her in 1953 after her suicide attempt. I had read this letter, I don't know how many times, and I've shared it with students and talked about it with them in the book form, but going into the archives and reading it and holding it, like feeling the imprint of the type, knowing that she's writing this in the throes of depression is an incredibly powerfully moving experience. And the ending of this letter, as she's saying, right, to let him, Ted Hughes, take over the house, the children, let me just die and be done with it. How can I get out of this ghastly defeatist cycle and grow up? I am only too aware that love and a husband are impossible to me at this time. I am incapable of being myself and loving myself. It's so powerfully emotional and difficult to read that. And she ends thinking of her children. Now the babies are crying. I must take them out to tea. So we do have this ending with sadness, as her life does, sort of 3 obituaries. There are not many that were published of her. One on the left, right, just says she died suddenly. From the Boston Herald doesn't mention the cause of death. Her hometown obituary, the Townsman, does mention cause of death, that she died of virus pneumonia, right, obscuring for a small town paper, probably written by her mother, obscuring that she died by suicide. This one from the St. Pancras Chronicle does, this is almost a disturbing one to read, that it makes it very clear from the start, found with her head in the gas oven, in the kitchen of their home in Fitzroy Road, it does seem to be very sort of almost too blunt in some ways, as it describes the nature of her death. But in 2018, the New York Times did a series of obituaries called Overlooked, people who became more famous after their deaths, who, right, they sort of feel deserve a New York Times obituary, but did not get one when they lived. And so even if she's remembered posthumously as having gained power through her writing and through her readers, it is hopeful to think, right, about the work that she's written that's gone on. Her collected poems, published in 1981. She was the first to win a posthumous Pulitzer Prize. So we see again the growth and the of her work, the recognition of her work increasing, right? And I do think that maybe it's the work that goes on, right? The work that ends with spring and wintering, or the very powerful ending in the bottom here of her poem, Lady Lazarus, out of the ash I rise with my red hair, and I eat men like air. I always think, you know, as I think about like her legacy and how she has lasted, and I think about the collection we have, which I didn't get to really talk as much as I probably should about the great work with the letters, with editing her work, and with sharing his work with other Plath scholars. Peter Steinberg has done. Plath's work is surviving because of the work of scholars and thriving because of the work of scholars. And I just wanted to read the end of an essay that she'd written where she's talking about poems, and she says that poems go surprisingly far among strangers around the world, even farther than the words of a classroom teacher or the prescriptions of a doctor, if they're very lucky, farther than a lifetime. And that's happened with Plath's work. They've gone farther than her lifetime. That it's because of what scholars do. It's because of, I hope, even though this is going to be in the classroom, I hope that the collection that we have is something I can share with students and will help Plath's work to go on farther than her lifetime, farther than my lifetime as a teacher and scholar as well. And right, it may be in her work that we can remember on her birthday that there is a ritual for being born twice, or there ought to be, and she's continually reborn as we talk about, read, and share her work. So thank you for your time and attention. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm happy to take questions from anyone in the audience. You can either unmute and ask them, or please feel free to put them in the chat as well.
Thank you so much, Gary. And like he just mentioned, please feel free to ask your questions however you feel comfortable. Like you said, put it in the chat, unmute. If you want to raise your hand, we'll call on you, however you feel comfortable. But thank you so much.
Hello. Yes, hello. I would.
Hi, Karen. I think we do hear you trying to maybe ask a question. I don't know if you're cutting out.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, yeah, we hear you. Go ahead.
Right, I wasn't sure whether you could hear me. I'm interested in the different versions of and the different revisions of the poems, and how the editors and scholars decide which one to use, and whether or not there actually is a definitive version of all of her work.
That's Thank you. That's a really great and difficult question to answer. It gets asked about a lot of different writers all the time. I do know that Karen Kugel, who worked on editing the journals and co-editing the letters, is working with Amanda Golden on editing a new complete version of Plath's poems. And so one of the things that happens, right, I have my copy of her collected poems here, which is getting blurred out by the camera. They get published and sometimes there are mistakes. And so editors and scholars can go back to manuscripts and have to try to figure out what was the intention of the writer. So they can look at individual places where typos may have been made or changes may have been made and try to figure out what's the last version of this. But then, of course, with something like Ariel in the book, it's also the order of poems and what poems are included. And do we accept the version that was a manuscript on Plath's desk as the final one, or do we want to see the one that was published that people have most widely known? Personally, my view as a reader and scholar is to think about how we can best interpret the writer's intention through manuscripts, rather than think about, how it's been published and how we have most often seen it.
Yeah, I mean, my feeling, I mean, obviously I'm not a scholar, but I would, as a writer myself, I would definitely want to see Plath's own versions, Plath's own order of poems. That was the collection that she had in mind, and therefore that's one that I think we need to pay attention to, as well as the others, of course.
Well, right. And the other poems that are in Ariel, she left those poems probably working toward a next collection, right? But not thinking of them fitting into that. And it is really useful to think about the poems as a book and how they communicate when read together. I forget the numbers he used, but Robert Frost said something like, in a book of 20 poems, the 21st poem is the book, right? That they all need to add up to an entire meaningful piece of art, which was Plath's intention and arrangement, and it was meaningful to her. And I think that's why I really do love that we have the restored edition, because it lets us get closer to her work and closer to her as a writer.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
There's a question in the chat. Who were her favorite poets? That's a really good question, and I think kind of biographically we can see that at different times in her life she was especially drawn to different poets. So I'll highlight a couple of them. When she was making this transitional period to finish the Colossus, she was really interested in the American poet Theodore Roethke, and that is one reason why the American edition is different at the end. I think she thought that some of the poems in Poem for a Birthday were too derivative of Roethke, and she didn't want to appear like an imitator of him. She was fascinated by Yeats, and at the end of her life, she was living in a house in London that has a blue plaque that Yeats had lived there. Favorite poet, I don't know, but it's impossible to separate her work from the influence that Ted Hughes, her husband, had on her, as well as the influence that she had on him, both as they're writing poems. And one thing maybe you could see in the documents when I projected them, that the drafts, that there's often something on the back of them. They were both reusing poems. So sometimes there's a Plath poem written on one side and a draft of a Hughes poem on the other. And so they're even sort of writing on the backs of each other's poetry. So yeah, those are just a couple of them, but I think if you look into it, you can also see influence of Shakespeare, of Chaucer, right? That she was incredibly well read. And I saw another question, working with the Buescher letters, and we'll be teaching them. Is there's anything you'd recommend, like something definitely to mention, focus on, what not to miss? I think one thing that's really interesting about those letters, okay, well, two things that are really interesting. One is to read them in context with some of the other letters she's writing at the time. So look at what she's writing to Buescher on days that she's also writing letters to her mother. Or I didn't mention this, but she's writing those two letters on February 4th. She writes, I believe, 4 letters on that day, but the one to Marcia Brown is also talking to Marcia Brown, who lives in America, about getting friends to come over to stay in one of the places Plath had been living in. So the house in Devon and the flat in London. I think she's trying to find someone who could rent out one of those houses. So she's planning for the future. While she also writes that letter to Buescher that seems much more baldly, nakedly, tragically honest, right? I cannot endure living, she's saying. So there's this real tension in how she's even presenting herself to different people on the same day. And the second thing I would say is to look at the poems that she's writing around that same time, especially the aerial poems that she's writing in October and November of 1962, and to see how I think lots of those poems, we can read them as being much more kind of regenerative and renewing, even biographically, if we also see the way that as her marriage is collapsing, you know, she's writing very powerful letters about how she's ready to make this on her own. And, you know, she doesn't, while she's angry at Hughes, right, she doesn't need him anymore. She can figure out these plans for her future and how she's going to make money and to make survival in London, in Devon as a writer. So I would really say to focus on the other letters she's writing at those same times, as well as to focus on the poems she's writing those days. Really grateful for such an attentive audience, and for all of the gratitude and the compliments that you've been putting in the chat. It's nice to be able to talk about Sylvia Plath and have so many people interested in her work and her life, especially in her work, because as she had said, that's the thing that can go on past a lifetime.
Thank you so much, Gary. Just open it up for another minute just to make sure if there's anyone else who was, you know, just still typing or we're still just thinking about a question. So if there's any last minute comments, please just put them in the chat. I see someone popping in that I can answer. The recording will be available. We will be sharing it with all the attendees after, you know, we process it. So you can look forward to that maybe next week or something, but we will definitely be sharing it. So thank you guys so much for allowing us to record it. But yes, it will be available.
And if you haven't figured out a way to celebrate Sylvia Plath's birthday yourself, you still have, if you're like me on the East Coast, you still have a few hours left. Go online, Google her tomato soup cake recipe. You can find it. It seems like it would be a perfectly appropriate way to celebrate her birthday by making a cake from one of her recipes.
Thank you so much. That's such a good recommendation.
I've never had it, so I'm not sure how a tomato cake would taste, but I've been told it's sort of like carrot cake.
Well, I think we must try it. Some people have tried it. Thank you. But again, it looks like I think no last minute questions. So again, I just wanted to thank you, Gary, just on behalf of the East Hampton Library, myself, just all the attendees. Feel like the chat spoke for itself, with the comments, just so moving and insightful and informative. And we just really appreciate you sharing your time and your knowledge and your expertise. And we just really appreciate you sharing all of this with us on Plath's birthday. So again, just thank you so much, Gary. And I just really appreciate everyone attending today. So thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for having me, and thank you for everyone who's here.
Absolutely. I just see, Karen, are we allowed to share it? Yes, it will be also available on our YouTube page. So again, that will be like an open link for anyone to view. So we have permission to do that. So yes, just to answer that question, it will be available, so you could pass it around or share the YouTube link. Absolutely. But yeah, so again, just thank you so much, and I hope everyone has a really lovely night. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you. Have a good night.
Bye.